Behind closed doors, some homes hide warmth and love, while others conceal pain and fear. For 12-year-old Sophia, her foster parents, Max and Nora, appeared to be the perfect caregivers, charitable, respected, and loving. But behind their smiles was a darkness no one dared to see. Imagine feeling trapped, like every cry for help is swallowed by silence, and no one would believe you even if they heard. That was Sophia's world. But this is also the story of how one brave girl, with the help of a compassionate teacher, exposed the truth and reclaimed her voice. Before we begin, let us know, where are you watching from? If you believe every child deserves justice and a chance to be heard, hit the like button and subscribe. Together, let's bring light to Sophia's story and stand for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Max and Nora were the kind of people everyone admired. At every charity event, school fundraiser, and neighborhood gathering, they were there, smiling warmly, offering generous donations, and engaging in thoughtful conversations. Max, with his calm demeanor and polished manners, had a way of putting everyone at ease. Nora, soft-spoken and nurturing, exuded kindness, always ready with a helping hand or a supportive word. To their neighbors and community, they were the epitome of grace and generosity. "They're such wonderful people," some would say. "Sophia is so lucky to have them," others would chime in. But those words, spoken with admiration, felt like sharp daggers to Sophia. To the world, Max and Nora were perfect. Behind closed doors, they were monsters. At just 12 years old, Sophia had learned to live in silence. She knew better than to cry or complain. Every word, every glance, every step was carefully measured to avoid angering Max or Nora. Max's sharp words would cut through her like glass. "Don't even think about talking to anyone. Who would believe you anyway? You're just a troublemaker." Nora was no less cruel, though her tactics were quieter. Her voice was soft, almost tender, but her words stung just as deeply. "We've given you everything, Sophia. A roof over your head, clothes to wear. You should be grateful instead of acting like this." Sophia felt the weight of their words every single day, crushing her small frame like an invisible burden. She didn't just fear them, she feared the world outside their door. After all, who would listen to her? Each night, as she sat alone in her tiny bedroom, Sophia would hear the echo of Max and Nora's voices from the kitchen below. Their laughter when entertaining guests was replaced by bitter arguments about money, their sharp tones cutting through the silence like knives. Sophia wanted to believe that someone, somewhere, could see through their facade. But in that moment, her reality felt inescapable, a nightmare hidden beneath the mask of a perfect family. Sophia lay curled up on her small bed every night, clutching her knees to her chest as if that could shield her from the storm downstairs. The walls of her room, thin and cold, couldn't block out the sharp voices that echoed from the kitchen. "I told you to stop wasting money." Max's deep, cutting tone would thunder through the house. "And I told you to let me handle it." Nora snapped back, her voice rising, sharper than broken glass. Sophia closed her eyes tightly, as if that could make the voices fade. But they never did. The arguments would drag on, relentless, each word heavier than the last. And then came the sound she dreaded most, the heavy thud of Max's footsteps on the creaking stairs. Each step sent a shiver down her spine. Closer and closer. Sophia held her breath. She could almost feel the weight of his presence before he even reached her door. Would he stop? Would he push it open? Or would he leave her alone this time? The tension in her chest grew unbearable. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared he might hear it. She stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, praying the nightmare wouldn't come any closer. Eventually, the footsteps receded, but her body remained frozen. Fear clung to her like a second skin, even as the house fell silent once more. To the outside world, Sophia's room seemed like a cozy little haven. A neatly tucked bed, a small desk with scattered school supplies, and a single window that let in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. But to Sophia, it was a cage. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing her fears tighter against her chest. She sat on the edge of her bed, her small hands gripping the fabric of her blanket, her eyes fixed on the faint line of light seeping through the crack under her door. That tiny glow wasn't comforting. It was cruel. It taunted her, whispering that freedom was so close, yet impossibly out of reach. She closed her eyes and pulled her knees up to her chest, her body trembling as if the coldness of the room had seeped into her bones. The arguments downstairs had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that warned of more to come. Sometimes in that suffocating quiet, Sophia allowed herself to dream. She thought about what it might feel like to have a real home. A place where she wasn't walking on eggshells, where she didn't have to flinch every time someone raised their voice. She imagined herself in a warm, sunlit room, laughter filling the air instead of anger. But as quickly as those dreams came, they dissolved. Her foster mother's voice would creep into her thoughts, cruel and soft. "You should be grateful, Sophia. We've given you everything. No one else would put up with you." Sophia opened her eyes, blinking away the tears that threatened to spill. She told herself that dreaming was pointless. This was her reality, a small room that kept her trapped, and a crack of light that wasn't meant for her. Yet, no matter how much she tried to bury it, a tiny question still lingered at the edges of her mind. What if? What if there's a way out? At school, Sophia was invisible. She slipped into the classroom each morning, her head down, avoiding eye contact. She always chose a seat in the back corner where no one would notice her. When her classmates raised their hands eagerly or shared jokes during group projects, Sophia stayed quiet, letting the noise wash over her like a distant wave. Her clothes were clean but worn, the fabric stretched and frayed at the edges. Her shoes were scuffed and too tight, leaving red marks on her heels. But what truly caught Miss Harper's attention wasn't her appearance. It was her demeanor. Sophia's eyes carried a sadness that no child should have to bear. They spoke of fear, of secrets too heavy for her small frame. Miss Harper, a seasoned teacher who had seen too much in her years, couldn't ignore what she saw. One day, during art class, Sophia reached across the table, and her sleeve slid up just enough to reveal a faint bruise on her wrist. It was small, barely noticeable, but it sent a chill through Miss Harper. She watched Sophia more closely after that, her heart sinking as the little signs added up. The way Sophia avoided speaking, the way her hands fidgeted nervously when someone stood too close, and the way she flinched at sudden noises. At lunch, as the other children ran out to play, Miss Harper gently called, "Sophia, could you stay back for a moment?" Sophia froze mid-step. She turned slowly, clutching the straps of her backpack. Her voice was barely audible as she said, "Yes, ma'am." Miss Harper knelt down to meet her gaze, her tone soft but firm. "Sophia, I've noticed you've been very quiet lately. I just want to make sure everything's okay. You can tell me if something's wrong." Sophia's hands tightened around her backpack. Her heart raced as she tried to find the right words. The room felt too big, too empty, and her mind screamed with fear. What if she doesn't believe me? What if this makes everything worse? "I'm fine," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. Miss Harper didn't push. She simply nodded and said, "Okay, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." As Sophia left the room, Miss Harper's eyes followed her. The hesitation in Sophia's voice, the way she avoided eye contact, it was clear something wasn't right. Miss Harper knew this wouldn't be the last time they spoke. Miss Harper began keeping a notebook. It wasn't something she did often, but Sophia's case felt different. Each day, she jotted down small details that nagged at her, a pattern she couldn't ignore. Sophia's clothes were always clean but rumpled, as though they'd been hurriedly pulled from a pile. Her shoes were old and worn, the soles thinning from overuse. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she carried herself. Her shoulders slouched, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if she were trying to disappear. The moments that worried Miss Harper the most were subtle but unmistakable. When another teacher asked Sophia about her weekend, her face froze. Her smile was forced, and her answer came out so quietly that the teacher had to ask her to repeat it. "It was fine," Sophia mumbled, barely audible, her eyes darting nervously toward the clock. Then there were the bruises. They were never large or obvious, but once Miss Harper noticed them, she couldn't unsee them. A faint mark on her wrist, a shadow of a bruise near her elbow. Always small, always fading, but enough to leave questions Miss Harper couldn't shake. Sophia, however, remained silent. Miss Harper tried to approach her gently, offering words of comfort without pressing too hard. "Sophia, you know you can talk to me, right? About anything. But every time, Sophia simply nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. It was as if she wanted to speak but was held back by an invisible chain, a fear so deep that it swallowed her words before they could form. Miss Harper's heart ached. She'd seen this before in children who carried burdens far too heavy for their young shoulders. She knew she couldn't force Sophia to open up, but she also knew she couldn't stand by and do nothing. So she watched. She listened. She waited. In her notebook, she wrote, "Worn clothes, hesitant answers, fidgeting hands, avoids eye contact, bruises, small but frequent, fearful when family is mentioned." Miss Harper read over her notes late one evening, her pen hovering above the page. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there were still too many gaps. What was Sophia hiding? And how could she reach her before it was too late? Sophia sat alone at the farthest table in the cafeteria, her lunch tray untouched. The hum of chatter and laughter filled the room, but she barely noticed. She was used to being invisible, blending into the background. "Mind if I sit here?" Sophia looked up, startled. Standing across from her was a girl she didn't recognize. She had curly brown hair tied in a loose ponytail, a bright purple sweater, and a curious smile. Without waiting for an answer, the girl placed her tray on the table and sat down. "I'm Olivia," the girl said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "I just moved here last week." Sophia nodded slightly. "I'm Sophia," she murmured, her voice barely audible. For a moment, there was silence. Then Olivia leaned in, lowering her voice. "You don't talk much, huh?" Sophia shrugged, her eyes darting toward the exit. "That's okay," Olivia continued, undeterred. "I used to be the same way when I was in foster care. It's hard to know who you can trust, you know?" Sophia froze. The word foster echoed in her mind. She looked at Olivia, her brows furrowing slightly. "Yeah," Olivia said, catching the look. "I've been in a couple of homes. Some were okay, some not so much." She paused, her expression softening. "But I just want to say, whatever you're dealing with, you don't deserve it. No one does. And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia didn't feel completely alone. She didn't say anything, but something about Olivia's words made her chest feel lighter, even if just a little. Still, fear clung to her like a shadow. She wanted to believe Olivia, to trust her, but the voices in her head wouldn't let her. What if she tells someone? What if it makes things worse? Sophia gave Olivia a small, cautious smile before turning back to her tray. The fear hadn't left, but for the first time there was also a flicker of something else. Hope. Sophia sat on her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Olivia's words echoed in her mind. "You don't deserve this. No one does." And then there was Miss Harper's steady voice. "I'm here for you, whenever you're ready." For so long, Sophia had felt trapped, powerless to fight back. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she could do something, anything to take control of her life. She reached under her mattress and pulled out an old phone, its screen cracked but still functional. Sophia had hidden it there for months, just in case. Tonight, it wasn't just a secret. It was her lifeline. The first time she took a photo, her hands were shaking so badly that the image came out blurry. She tried again, this time steadying the phone with both hands. The screen captured the faint bruise on her arm, a painful reminder of Max's outburst just days before. Every night, Sophia waited until the house was quiet. She crept into the hallway, her footsteps light as a whisper. She'd learned to memorize the creaky floorboards, avoiding them like traps. In the dim light of the living room, she found Max's briefcase. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a mess of papers. Most of it didn't make sense to her. Bills, receipts, account statements. But one thing stood out. Large sums of money labeled foster care allowance, alongside extravagant expenses like weekend getaway and designer clothing. Sophia snapped photos of every page she could, her breath catching with each shutter sound. One night, she recorded them. Sophia stood in the shadows of the hallway, her phone hidden behind her back. She pressed record, just as Max's voice thundered from the kitchen. "You think I care about what she wants? She's lucky to have a roof over her head." "Keep her in line," Nora replied coldly. "We can't afford another visit from the agency." Sophia's grip tightened on the phone. Her heart raced, her fear battling against a growing sense of determination. This wasn't just for her anymore. It was for the truth. At school, she handed the phone and the photos to Miss Harper, her hands trembling. I found these, Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. It's proof. Miss Harper took the phone gently, her expression a mix of sorrow and resolve. You've been so brave, Sophia, she said softly. This is a big step. For the first time, Sophia felt a flicker of hope, real hope. But deep down she knew this was just the beginning. Max had always been watchful, but now his eyes seemed sharper, more calculating. He began noticing little things. Sophia's subtle glances at her backpack, the way she clutched it tightly when he was near. One evening, as she hurried past him in the hallway, he narrowed his eyes. "What are you hiding?" he barked. Sophia froze, her heart pounding in her chest, but she quickly shook her head and muttered, "Nothing." Max didn't press further that time, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. The next night, Sophia was in her room when she heard the heavy thud of Max's footsteps climbing the stairs. She stiffened, her hands gripping the blanket as he approached. He didn't knock. He never did. The door swung open, and Max's broad figure filled the doorway. "I need to check something," he said flatly, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Sophia's heart raced as she watched him scan the room, his eyes moving from the desk to the dresser. He strode over to her nightstand, yanking open the drawer with a sharp motion. Finding nothing, he turned toward the small closet. Her breath caught in her throat. "Please, no. Please don't look under the mattress." But Max's attention landed on the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. He leaned down and flipped open the lid. Inside were a few old notebooks and random trinkets, a collection of things Sophia had managed to keep over the years. Then his gaze shifted to the desk drawer where, just days ago, Sophia had hidden the cracked phone. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. The phone wasn't there anymore. She'd already handed it to Miss Harper. But what if he found the blank notebook where she'd scribbled her plans, or the loose pieces of paper she'd almost forgotten to throw away? Max yanked the drawer open. Sophia held her breath. The room felt unbearably silent, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, Max straightened, slamming the drawer shut. "Don't think I don't notice," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You'd better not be trying anything stupid, Sophia." She nodded quickly, her lips pressed tightly together. He turned and left, the door slamming behind him. Sophia sat motionless, her body trembling. The room once again felt like a cage, but this time it was worse. Max's suspicion had turned the air heavy, and every corner seemed to hold the weight of his shadow. She pulled her knees to her chest, whispering to herself, "Stay strong. Just a little longer." The house felt heavier now, like the walls themselves had learned to listen. Max had become more unpredictable, his eyes constantly darting to Sophia, as if trying to catch her in the act of something. The unease in the air was suffocating. Every time he passed her in the hallway, she felt his gaze linger too long, his presence looming like a shadow she couldn't escape. One evening, after dinner, Max cornered her in the living room. His voice was calm, but his tone carried a sharpness that made Sophia's skin crawl. "Do you think I don't notice?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. Sophia backed up until her shoulders touched the wall. She shook her head quickly, her throat dry. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. Max leaned in, his face just inches from hers. His breath smelled faintly of coffee, but his words were anything but warm. "If you think you can say something to anyone," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, "you'll regret it. Do you understand me?" Sophia's chest tightened. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She nodded quickly, her hands trembling at her sides. Max straightened up and stared down at her, his expression cold. "Good," he said curtly before turning and walking away. Sophia stayed frozen against the wall long after he left. Her knees felt weak, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but she couldn't. Instead, she clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't, not now. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Max's words over and over in her mind. His warning was clear, but so was her resolve. Sophia whispered into the silence, "I won't let him win." The courtroom buzzed softly as the hearing began. Sophia sat stiffly at the front, her small frame dwarfed by the chair. Her hands gripped the edges of the seat, her knuckles pale against the wood. Across from her, Max and Nora sat poised, their polished appearances a stark contradiction to the truth she carried in her heart. Max, in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light, sat with his shoulders squared, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Nora dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her face the picture of heartbreak. The two of them looked every bit like grieving parents wrongfully accused. The judge's voice broke the murmurs. The defense may call their first witness. A neatly dressed woman in her 60s stepped forward. Clara, the miller's neighbor, adjusted her glasses as she approached the stand. Her pearl necklace glinted under the courtroom lights, adding to the impression of sincerity she exuded. Clara offered the judge a polite nod before beginning, her voice calm and rehearsed. "I've been Max and Nora's neighbor for over a decade," she started, glancing sympathetically at the couple. "They've always been kind, generous people who've gone above and beyond for Sophia." She paused, adjusting her glasses again as if to underscore her confidence. "I've seen them take her to school, bring her to community events, and provide her with everything she could possibly need. They've given her a stable, loving home." Sophia's chest tightened as the words hit her like waves crashing against a fragile dam. She wanted to shout, to scream that it wasn't true, but her voice remained trapped in her throat. Clara turned to the judge, her tone firm. "I've never seen or heard anything that would make me question their care for her. Max and Nora are good people." Max's lips curved into a faint smile, and Nora reached over to squeeze Clara's hand. The exchange was quick but deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done. Sophia's stomach churned. She darted a glance at Miss Harper, who sat nearby with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her teacher's calm expression didn't waver, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of resolve. The judge leaned forward, scribbling notes on her pad. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara. You may step down." Clara offered a reassuring smile to Max and Nora as she returned to her seat. Sophia watched helplessly as the judge's gaze lingered on her. The prosecutor stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, the defense paints a picture of a perfect family, but appearances can be deceiving. We will provide evidence today that reveals a very different reality." Sophia swallowed hard. Her pulse quickened as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Clara's testimony had shaken her, planting seeds of doubt she couldn't ignore. The judge nodded. "Proceed with the next witness." Then her name was called. Sophia's breath caught in her chest. She felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her. Her legs trembled as she stood, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every sound but one, the echo of her own fear. Sophia's legs felt like they would give out as she walked to the witness stand. Every step echoed in her mind, each one heavier than the last. The courtroom felt impossibly large, and the weight of countless eyes watching her made her stomach churn. She sat down, her small hands gripping the edges of the wooden seat. The judge looked at her kindly but expectantly, her pen poised over her notepad. "Sophia," the judge began, her voice steady. "Take your time. Please tell us what's been happening." Sophia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat felt dry, her words caught in a web of fear. She glanced toward Max and Nora, who sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. Max's piercing gaze sent a chill down her spine. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They're not who you think they are." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sophia's voice cracked. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "They yell at me all the time. They call me useless. They say I should be grateful just to live there." Max scoffed loudly, cutting through her words. "This is ridiculous," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. He turned toward the judge, shaking his head. "Sophia is making this all up. She's a troubled child who doesn't appreciate what she's been given. We've done everything for her." The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence, but the damage had been done. Sophia's voice faltered again. "I'm not lying," she said weakly, her eyes welling with tears. Max seized the moment, his voice rising. "Your Honor, we've supported her, loved her like our own, and this is how she repays us? Lies and slander?" He gestured toward Clara, sitting nearby. "You heard our neighbor. We've been nothing but kind to her." Sophia's shoulders slumped. Her head hung low, her tears threatening to spill. The words she had practiced in her mind over and over now felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She glanced at Miss Harper, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. It was enough to steady her. but not enough to drown out the doubt creeping into her heart. The judge looked at Sophia with a mixture of sympathy and expectation. "Sophia," she said gently, "do you have anything else to say?" Sophia hesitated, her fingers trembling in her lap. Her voice wavered as she finally replied, "No, Your Honor, not right now." As she stepped down from the stand, the weight of failure pressed against her chest. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Sophia felt her hope slipping away. But deep inside, a quiet determination flickered. This wasn't over yet. The courtroom had grown tense, the silence punctuated only by the sound of pens scribbling notes and the occasional creak of a chair. Sophia sat back in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were downcast, her earlier resolve wavering. "Your Honor," Miss Harper began, standing from her seat. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable weight of urgency behind it. "If I may, I'd like to present additional evidence that supports Sophia's claims." The judge nodded, gesturing for her to proceed. Miss Harper approached the stand with a folder clutched in her hands. She placed it on the table and carefully opened it. "Over the past few months, I've observed several troubling signs," she said, her eyes glancing briefly at Sophia before returning to the judge. "And I've taken steps to document them." She pulled out a photograph and handed it to the judge. This was taken during a school activity. You can see a faint bruise on Sophia's wrist. Her voice softened. "It wasn't the only time I noticed marks like these." The courtroom murmured softly. Max shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. Nora reached for his hand, her expression carefully composed, but her fingers trembling slightly. Miss Harper continued, presenting a series of documents. "Here are statements from other teachers at Sophia's school. They noted her withdrawn behavior, her reluctance to participate, and how she often appeared exhausted." The judge flipped through the papers silently, her expression unreadable. Finally, Miss Harper held up another set of documents. "And these," she said, her voice firm, "are financial records that Sophia managed to bring to me. They show foster care payments being misused, money meant for Sophia spent on luxury goods, vacations, and other personal expenses." The tension in the room was palpable. Even the quietest rustle of paper seemed amplified. Max's eyes darted to the folder on the table, his lips pressing into a thin line. Nora leaned in, whispering something to him, but Max didn't respond. Miss Harper took a deep breath before addressing the judge again. "Sophia is just a child, Your Honor. She's been brave enough to speak up, but she shouldn't have to carry this burden alone. These documents, these observations, they paint a picture of neglect and exploitation that can't be ignored." The judge looked up, her gaze lingering on Miss Harper. She nodded slowly but said nothing, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. Sophia's heart lifted slightly. For the first time, she felt like someone was truly fighting for her. But as she glanced at the judge, she noticed the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. The judge leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Thank you, Miss Harper," she said. "Your evidence is compelling, but I'll need to hear more before making any determinations." Sophia's chest tightened. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Miss Harper returned to her seat, her face calm but her grip on her pen betraying her nerves. She leaned toward Sophia, whispering softly, "Don't worry, we're not done yet." Sophia nodded, a small spark of hope reigniting within her. This wasn't over. Not yet. Sophia's palms were sweaty as she clutched the edge of the seat. The courtroom felt like it was closing in around her, the air heavy with anticipation. Miss Harper's evidence had shifted the tone of the trial, but it still wasn't enough. The judge's measured expressions and Max's composed demeanor told her that the scales hadn't fully tipped. Sophia's heart pounded. What if they don't believe me? What if nothing changes? Suddenly, she remembered the recording, the one she hadn't dared to mention before. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been afraid it wouldn't be enough, or worse, that it would only make things harder. But now, sitting there with her courage dwindling, she realized this was her chance. Sophia stood abruptly, her small frame trembling but resolute. "Your Honor," she said, her voice wavering but audible. "There's something else. I have a recording." The courtroom fell silent. Every head turned toward her, including Max's. His confident smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by a sharp, suspicious glare. Sophia hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached into her backpack and pulled out the phone. "It's something I recorded," she stammered, her voice growing stronger. "It's them, Max and Nora. What they said when they thought no one could hear." The prosecutor stepped forward, taking the phone from her trembling hands. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to play this recording for the court." The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression sharpening. "Proceed." The audio crackled to life. At first, there was the sound of clinking dishes and muffled voices. Then Max's voice cut through, cold and calculating. "Keep the kid quiet, and the money will keep rolling in." Nora's voice followed, softer but no less chilling. "We can't afford for her to say anything. If she does, it's over for us." The room seemed to freeze. The faint hum of the recording faded into silence, but the weight of their words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sophia's breath hitched. She dared to glance at Max, whose face had gone pale. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. The judge's pen stopped moving. Her gaze shifted from the prosecutor to Max and Nora. "Do you deny that this is your voice?" she asked, her tone firm. Max opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Nora fumbled with her tissue, her hands trembling as she avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. The judge leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This recording is clear evidence of neglect and exploitation. It cannot be ignored." Sophia exhaled, her shoulders sagging as the weight she'd carried for so long began to lift. The judge's words had shattered the lies Max and Nora had so carefully constructed. Miss Harper reached over and gave Sophia's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You did it," she whispered. Sophia nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that justice was within reach. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Sophia sat at the edge of her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. Miss Harper was beside her, her steady presence grounding Sophia in the moment. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "After reviewing the evidence, including financial records, witness testimonies, and the audio recording presented, this court finds Max and Nora guilty of child neglect and financial fraud." Sophia felt her breath catch. For a moment she couldn't process the words. Then, the weight of the judge's decision began to sink in, bringing with it a strange mix of relief and sadness. The judge's stern gaze turned toward Max and Nora. "Your actions have caused immeasurable harm to this child. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your status as foster parents and will face sentencing for your crimes." Max stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "We gave her everything." Nora clutched his arm, her pale face streaked with tears. "Please, Your Honor, we didn't mean." The judge raised a hand, silencing them both. "Your manipulations end here," she said firmly. "Bailiffs, escort them out." Two officers approached, flanking Max and Nora. As they were led away, their protests grew fainter, swallowed by the murmurs of the courtroom. Sophia watched them go, her emotions tangled. She felt no triumph, no sense of victory, only the quiet realization that the nightmare was finally over. The judge turned to Sophia, her voice softer now. "Sophia, you've shown incredible bravery today. I want you to know that none of this was your fault. You deserve a safe, loving home." Sophia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to cry in front of so many people. The judge continued, "Arrangements have been made to place you with a new family, one that has been carefully chosen to provide the care and support you need." Sophia's chest tightened. A new family, a new chance. It sounded so simple, yet it carried so much weight. As the courtroom emptied, Miss Harper knelt beside Sophia. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. Sophia hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's a lot." Miss Harper smiled, her voice filled with warmth. "It is a lot, but you don't have to face it alone anymore." Sophia looked into her teacher's kind eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe things could be better. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Sophia sat on the courthouse steps, her hands resting on her lap, staring at the ground. The verdict had been delivered. The nightmare was over, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead felt overwhelming. She heard soft footsteps approaching and looked up to see Miss Harper standing before her. Her teacher's face was kind, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "Sophia," Miss Harper began, her voice gentle but steady. "I've been thinking about what happens next." Sophia blinked, unsure of what to say. She had already prepared herself for the idea of starting over with strangers, of having to build trust from scratch once again. But then Miss Harper knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to start over alone," she said softly. "You've been through so much, and I think I can help." She hesitated for just a moment, then continued, "Sophia, would you like to live with me?" Sophia's breath caught. The words didn't register at first, as if her mind refused to believe them. "Live with you?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Miss Harper nodded, a small, hopeful smile on her lips. "Yes, I want to give you a home. A real home. Somewhere safe, where you don't have to feel afraid anymore." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Instead, she nodded, her chin trembling as a sob escaped her. Miss Harper pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her as she cried. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now, and you're not alone anymore." For the first time in years, Sophia felt something unfamiliar. Peace. A weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying began to lift. When she finally pulled back, her tear-streaked face glowed with a shy smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Harper smiled back, brushing a strand of hair from Sophia's face. "You don't have to thank me. You deserve this." The late afternoon sun bathed the small porch in warm golden light. Sophia sat cross-legged on the wooden steps, a soft breeze playing with her hair. She cradled a steaming mug of cocoa in her hands, its warmth spreading through her fingers. The yard stretched out before her, a patch of green framed by the picket fence Miss Harper's family had painted years ago. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it felt safe. It felt like home. Sophia's gaze drifted upward, drawn to the vast expanse of the sky. Clouds floated lazily across the brilliant blue, their shapes shifting and dancing in the gentle wind. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight kiss her face. For the first time in years, she felt no fear, no weight pressing down on her chest. The ache that had lived in her heart for so long had been replaced by something new, peace. She opened her eyes, a small, genuine smile spreading across her lips. It wasn't the kind of smile she forced for others. This one came from deep within, from a place that had long been hidden. "Finally," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I found where I belong." Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Miss Harper stepped out, carrying a plate of cookies and a soft, warm grin. "Do you need anything else, Sophia?" she asked. Sophia shook her head, glancing over her shoulder. "No, I'm okay." She paused, her smile widening. "I'm better than okay." Miss Harper sat beside her, placing the cookies between them. The two of them sat in comfortable silence, at the stillness broken only by the distant laughter of children playing on the street. Sophia leaned back, resting her head against the porch railing. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was home.